Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Before we start with our today's analysis, we have an announcement. BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS is conducting a national scholarship test which is scheduled to be conducted on 6th of March 2022. How do you register? Follow the link given in the description box, give the necessary information and you would stand a chance of winning some attractive scholarships. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says an appetite for war but no place for peace. For the last few days, we have discussed about Russia's war on Ukraine. We did discuss what was the reason for tracing this war. We did discuss the geopolitical ramifications of it. What could be the implications for Russia? How will it impact India? All this was discussed in the last few days. But this article is primarily focusing through the lens of ethics. So this article here is speaking about war ethics, and we will also take an elaborate look about just war theory. First up, the author brings into picture the imaginative mode of the Russian crisis. You turn on the TV, you have Vladimir Putin in all news channels. He says that he is withdrawing from the war, he is regretted for going about with this particular war, and he has remorse and he is publicly apologizing for this particular war. Now, knock knock, get up from the slumber. The author says such things may not happen, it happens only in the imaginative world. But one of the scenarios which has happened in India in such a situation, the author recollects, is in reference to Ashoka. Ashoka was one of the greatest emperor that India has seen. He famously renounced war and conquest. So the author here brings into limelight about the ethical perspective of war, how war changed a person from how he was aggressive to following the principles of pacifism. We all know about Ashoka. Ashoka has two phases in his life, one before the Kalinga War, one after the Kalinga War. Before the Kalinga War, we know for the fact that Ashoka was ruthless. He was also shrewd as well. He had a lot of political acumen. He wanted to capture large swathes of land. So, what he was a passionate leader who wanted to bring everything under his control. All his dissent was crushed, opposition was swept aside, rebels imprisoned. That was the political acumen when it comes to Ashoka. So the point that we are speaking is that before the Kalinga War, Ashoka was the greatest ambitious leader that the world had seen. Then comes the Kalinga War. During the Kalinga War, there was a large scale destruction, displacement of 1,50,000 people, death of at least 1 lakh people, and this left him distraught and changed his perspective about life as well. So, what are we speaking about? We are speaking about Ashoka before the Kalinga War and Ashoka after the Kalinga War. After the Kalinga War took place, what we see is the transformation of Ashoka. He enters the city, he watches all these orphans and women who were crying, families who had lost their dear and near ones. This left him crushed, and because they were innocent souls who were destitute right now, this somewhere hit Ashoka very hard. Kalinga was crushed, his men also praised Ashoka as well, but something else was happening in Ashoka's mind where he said, if this is victory, what then is defeat when so many people were crying for the near and dear ones? This particular incident transformed Ashoka. He was confronted by the destruction that he had caused. There were corpses and broken shields everywhere. Ashoka, who was once fierce, was melting down. A once violent and a fiery mind was once shaken, and ultimately, what we have is a new Ashoka after the Kalinga War. So, Ashoka, who once believed in capturing places, believed in a new philosophy called Sarvajana Sarvalokahita, where it was about welfare of all human beings in the world. So, the author says that we have seen such transformations in the past in our history books. So, going forward, we require similar such transformations. We need to avoid war as it causes a large scale destruction, as it leads to bloodshed, as it leads to loss of lives, and we have to overcome such issue. War is not an answer, but instead there are other tools like diplomacy, talking to each other, and ultimately bringing about a resolution to the disputed issue. So the author asks the government and the world leaders to renounce this very path of war and also come up with the realistic output of negotiation. Now what we have to look into picture is some of the international morality principles with respect to the war, and we also have a theory called as the just war theory. Let us try and understand this ethical perspective with respect to the war. When we speak about international morality, there are two important principles. One is the principle of realism. The other is the principle of idealism. What is this principle of realism? It is the realistic assessment of the dangers from external enemies and take defensive measures. What exactly happens? Let me give you an example. We have India, who has external threats emanating from Pakistan and China. Back in the 1950s, India believed in the principle of idealism, where we wanted to sort out differences and issues and concerns with respect to India and China on an amicable basis, on a peaceful basis. India also initiated a plan of Indi Chini Bye Bye with the principle of idealism. But what did China gift us? China gave us the 1962 war. Ideally, what we should have done is a realistic assessment of the dangers from China, and we should have also taken defensive measures, because if China in the near future wants to attack, it is already stopped. There is deterrent effect. That is why India also became a nuclear state as well. So the principle of realism basically goes on to say that we should not merely put faith in another country, but we need to take up our own national interest into picture. It is about power and self-interest. It is about stability and balance of power. If we had become nuclear, China would not have initiated any action against India in 1962. So making a realistic assessment of the dangers coming from another country and making sure that there is a deterrent effect is what is called as realism. So realism is basically about the concept of interest, and this is about the national interest. When we speak about realism, there are two types of realism. One is the classical realism, the other is the neo-realism. What is the classical realism? The classical realism is where every country wants to dominate on the sphere. We have the United States of America, we also have the Soviet Union as well. They wanted to dominate. So the classical realism is about leaders, is about country wanting to dominate on the global sphere. Then we also have the neo-realism. What is neo-realism? Basically, in this particular era, after the 1990, we have number of international organizations. Even if one country wants to dominate, there are international structures, structural constraints that are put up in the international system, which will not let them dominate completely, is what is called as neo-realism. So neo-realism happens after 1990, and before that what we have is a classical realism, where countries wanted to dominate. We have understood what is realism. Next, what we have is idealism. What is idealism? Importance were given to the moral values and ideals rather than power and the pursuit of the national interest. One such example that we can discuss is with respect to the Hindi Chini Bye Bye. Ideally, we should have assessed what China is all about, its intentions and its future ambitions, without which we went ahead with the pacific tendencies. We decided to trust our neighbor. That did not serve us good. That is what is idealism. So basically, when it comes to idealism, it is about the adherence to the moral principles. It is about establishing good faith, reciprocity and honoring agreements, which is the need of the idealism. And now, as part of the assignment, you give me another example with respect to India, where India has promoted idealism in its foreign relations. Now that we have discussed about the international morality, we have something called as the just war theory. The just war theory basically goes on to say that it is right for us to defend ourselves. It is also right for us to go ahead with the war as well. When we have to go for the war, when the war is initiated, what should be done and what should happen after the war is what is called as just war theory. The just war theory can be defined into three different principles. One is called as the just ad bellum, that is why war has to be initiated. Is it moral for the country to raise a war? Then after that, what we have is just in bello, and finally the last principle is just post bellum. What is this just ad bellum? This is a principle where war is a necessity. Let's say, for example, you're not an aggressor state. So in the present situation, you can take the example of Russia and Ukraine. Who is the aggressor in this case? It is Russia. Who happens to be the victim of this particular war? It happens to be the Ukraine. So in this case, if Ukraine has to defend itself on the principle of self-defense, that is what is called as just ad bellum. So you're going for the war in order to prevent the escalation of ties, in order to prevent the human right miseries, and in order to protect your own people. So when it is right to go for the war is what is called as just bellum. So what are the principles under the just ad bellum? You have the last resort, which means all other modes must have been tried first. So we have diplomacy, we also have other ways of talking as well. We might have directly interacted with the leaders, There might be negotiations between the parties as well. United Nations would have also discussed with respect to this particular issue. When nothing of this sort works out, as a last resort, you take up the war. Diplomacy doesn't work, other countries mediation doesn't work, United Nations has tried to help, that doesn't work. When all of this is left out, as a final resort, what we have as an option is the last resort. Then we have the right intention, where the intention of the war is to right or wrong. Just cause, there must be a good reason for going to the cause. It has to have a right intention. The aim of the war is not to pursue individual interest, but it should be at the cost of national interest. Right authority, only public authorities are legitimate. Terrorist organizations are not enough, which means there has to be a government. This government has to be elected by the people, and such a government should be selecting this option, and this should not be at the hand of terrorist organizations who are running that particular country, or if that particular country is under the military coup. So recognized government should only go for the war. Comparative justice, that the suffering cost must be less than the suffering that exists. So you had an option of not going to war, you also had the option of going to war as well. Had you not gone to the war, the number of casualties would have increased, number of people who have lost their lives would have also increased. In order to reduce that, you are going to war so that it does not escalate, number of lives are not lost in the near future. And finally, it is also about the probability of success, where there must be good grounds for concluding the aims of this particular war in itself, and it is about national interest. These are some of the principles under just ad bellum. Then we also have the principle of just in bello. So when the war is initiated, what are the principles that a particular country has to follow? This includes discrimination. Acts of war should be directed at the combatants and not civilians. What do we mean by it? There are people who are fighting the war. You also have the army, the navy, as well as the air force. These are the people who are taking up on the war. So if there is a country which is continued to war against another country, it should be against the army or the navy or air force of that particular country, that is the combatants, and civilians should not be disturbed. So during the war, civilians should not be killed, but it should be only the armed combat people. Minimum force, death and destruction should be limited during the war, and the force used must be proportional to the wrong endured to the possible good that may come. So basically, we are speaking about how it has to be taken during that particular proceedings. And during the proceedings of the war, if we have an enemy soldier who surrender and he is not assumed to be a threat, he should also be respected. And one such example that we have is in reference to the Shimla Agreement, under which India agreed to release about 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. And finally, prohibition of evil practices like genocide, torturing soldiers should also be followed as a process of just in bello. And finally, what we have is called as the just post bellum. And in just post bellum, what happens after the war? This is about the settlement, this is about the termination of the war, including the responsibility of rebuilding that particular territory. And civilians should also be immune from the punitive post-war measures as well. For example, in Iraq, what we had was the American capture of Iraq. Why? Because it said that our Iraq had a large scale weapons of mass destruction. So during this period, only Saddam Hussein was ultimately killed and civilians were not disturbed. So such measures will also have to be taken when we have war. It is this that we have to understand in reference to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says a negation of the individual and a collective moral decay. The article here is speaking about death penalty. It is speaking about capital punishment and the issues concerning the death penalty with respect to the recent judgment passed by the Sessions Court in Ahmedabad. We had the 2008 Ahmedabad blast. We had a sessions court which also delivered recently, and this particular judgment clearly went on to put capital punishment on few people and life imprisonment. So the article here primarily bases its arguments against the capital punishment imposed by the sessions court. When we look into the statistics, according to one of the report given by Project 39A at the National Law University Delhi, a total of 488 prisoners prisoners in India as of 2021 were on death row, which is an increase of nearly 21% from 2020. And if you add many convicts in this particular case in 2022, it will also give a raise of about 10% for the year 2022. So this article goes on to say that what we are witnessing in India is an increasing cases of death penalty, and unfortunately this is leading to what is called as retributive justice, says the author. In punishment, there are different types of theories. What are these different types of theories? One, what we have is a deterrent theory. Then we have retributive theory. Third is the preventive theory. Fourth, what we have is the reformative theory. So in this article, the author speaks primarily about the retributive theory. First, let us understand what is the deterrent theory of punishment. Let's say, for example, there is a person who's committed a murder. This person has committed a murder, so the court of law imprisons him for life. So there is life imprisonment on this particular person. So because he is losing away his life of liberty, he does not have the freedom to roam any which ways in the near future. This may in the near future deter others. So the deterrent theory of punishment basically goes on to say you impose a punishment on a person which prevents other people from committing an act. So the purpose of selection of this type of punishment on the offenders is to deter them from committing a crime. Then what we have is called as the retributive theory. What is this retributive theory? It is about the severity of punishment should be proportionate to the gravity of the offense. This goes with the ancient principle that you hurt me, I hurt you, an eye for an eye. Basically, if a person has committed an offense where the victim has been a sufferer of a particular incident, similar such punishment will be given to that person. If he has killed a person, another person will also be killed. If a particular person has been cut off with the hand, the other person's hand will also be cut off. That is what is called as retributive justice. In this case, what happens when the victim suffers, similar suffering is inflicted on the person who has committed that crime. Then we have what is called as the preventive theory of punishment. What is this preventive theory of the punishment? Basically, there are people who commit the crime. These people should not be let in the society, but instead they should be put in the prison. So preventing him basically means that he will not be part of the society. He'll be removed from the society and placed away from the society. So for jailing a particular person, he is prevented from committing that particular crime in the near future is what is called as preventive theory. So a person has committed a murder, this person is put behind bars, so is not outside in the society. So preventing this person from committing a future crime is what is called as preventive theory. Finally, what we have is a reformative theory where the object of punishment should be to bring about moral reformation in the offender. When it comes to the reformative theory, if a person has committed an illegal act, we have to reform him, we have to change him, we have to bring a metamorphosis in that particular person. So this reformed person is reintroduced into the society. So the author in this particular case goes on to say that the court has chosen the retributive justice rather than the reformative justice which has been practiced in India. This raises a couple of issues and concerns with respect to the punishment. What are the issues? When we speak about the capital punishment, we have the rarest of the rare doctrine which we have discussed in the last week. So when this rarest of the rare doctrine, what happens? There is lot of discretion that is being given to the judges. With this particular discretion, they can also put a person behind the bars, they can also convict this particular person, and ultimately death penalty can also be imposed on this particular person with a lot of discretion given to the court of law. So death penalty grants the state the monopoly of violence, which should not have ideally be done because India has opted for the reformative mode of punishment. This is the first issue. The second issue the author speaks about: court orally convicted in mass several of the accused instead of declaring the charges proved against them separately. What is the issue here? When it comes to the criminal justice system, we have two types of circumstances. One is what is called as aggravating circumstance. The other is the mitigating circumstance. What is an aggravative circumstance? circumstance when it comes to a crime. Let me explain and simplify this process for you. Let's say, for example, there is a habitual offender, a person who's committed an offense for n number of times. Let's say a serial killer, he falls under the aggravating circumstance, or there is a murder that is being committed, and this particular murder was planned from a very long time. This happens to be a cold-blooded murder. There were people involved in it. That is what is called as aggravating circumstances. So in the aggravating circumstances, everything is pre-planned. It happens in a cold manner. There is heinous nature when it comes to that particular incident. One such example that we can take off is back in the year 2012, we had the Delhi gang rape case, which is an example of an aggravating circumstances. The heinous nature of this crime is such a way that you cannot imagine that such crimes can be committed against the humans. So one is the aggravating circumstance, which is about the habitual offenders, which is about the serial offenders. Then what we also have is called as the mitigating circumstance. Let's say there is a person who is about 19 years of age. He has the responsibility on his shoulders to take care of his brother and sister who are about 9 and 15 years of age. So these three people are hungry. So there is a person of 19 years of age who does not have a job. He goes to a nearby bakery, asks that person for a pound of bread. Why? Because they are extremely hungry in this particular situation. But all of a sudden, this particular person of that bakery, the owner of the bakery, does not give a loaf of bread. So what does he do? He pushes this owner in the bakery, picks up this particular bread. While he pushes the person, it leads to accidental death of that particular owner of the bakery. So what we have to look is at the aggravating circumstances or the mitigating circumstance. In this case, it is more about mitigating circumstances. Why? Because the intent of this particular person was not to kill that person, and the intent of the person was to get a loaf of bread and take care of his brother and sister. And because the situation forced that person to commit such a crime, such is taken as the mitigating circumstance. So basically, when we are speaking about the mitigating circumstance, the offender was coerced, threatened to commit the offense. In that case, it is a mitigating offense. It was because of the provocation that act was committed, and also because there is a necessity in that particular case which he did not pre-plan. So the author in this particular case goes on to say, when you are en masse convicting the people, you are not looking at the mitigating circumstances of the individual. Yes, when the conviction is happening, what we had was the conviction of large number of people for death penalty, but they are also individuals. These individuals will also have their own life as well. They will have poverty related issues. Why they did that, that is the mitigating circumstance that will also have to be taken into the loop. Since that was not taken into the loop, there is an issue with this particular judgment, says this article. So basically, the aggravating circumstances, the mitigating circumstances will all have to be heard, but in this case, the mitigating circumstance was not taken into picture by the court of law, and ultimately this raises couple of concerns and issues with respect to the death penalty and capital punishment as a whole. What is the issue with the death penalty? When a person is put behind bars, he is under the death penalty row. He does not know when he will be killed, when his life would be snatched by the government. So during this particular process, he goes through what is called as the death row syndrome. So what is the death row syndrome? There is inevitable anxiety. He goes through a lot of emotional issues. He goes through the psychological illness. This may lead to agitation, psychosis, delusion, paranoia, self-destructive behavior, which is called as the death row syndrome. There was one of the report called as the death worthy report. This was a report given by the National Law University as part of the Project 39A under the guidance of mental health professional from Nimhans, Bengaluru. According to this particular report, 60% of the prisoners on death row interviewed for the study were found to be enduring mental illness, and longer they spent in anticipation of their possible execution. This happens to be the worst mental health. So a person who is put to the death penalty goes through a lot of psychological issues issues and this may disturb him mentally is another major concern with respect to the death penalty. In fact, in the year 2016, we had the Law Commission of India in its 262nd report had said that this whole issue of capital punishment should be abolished and should be only retained for terrorism related offences. In the debate of the Constituent Assembly, we also have Dr. B.R. Ambedkar ji, who was personally in favor of the abolition of the death penalty. So this article goes on to say the criminals no doubt deserve to be punished, but the mitigating circumstances will have to be taken into picture. The reformative attribute will have to be taken into picture, and we should punish such a person, but a relook has to be taken with respect to the capital punishment and the severity of the punishment is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about role and functions of the governor. We have discussed about the issues and concerns with respect to the governor and the cabinet ministers in our last few CNAs. So let's have a bird eye view about what is this article all about. The primary issue between the governor, council of ministers is with respect to the appointment. What is it about the appointment? It is the central government which appoints the governor. So whenever an appointment is being made, a politically active person from a ruling party in the central government is appointed to the state government. So in such a case, what it will lead to is friction between the cabinet ministers and the governor, primarily because they have different ideological patterns, they are from different political setups, they are from different political parties, and as a result, what we have to ensure is such politically active people should not be appointed. And in the past, there are conventions that the chief minister and the cabinet ministers will also have to be heard when such an appointment is made is the first issue. The second issue is about aid and advice. We all know from the fact that we have Article 163 of the Indian Constitution which says there shall be a council of ministers with the chief minister at the head to aid and advise the governor in the exercise of the functions, except in so far as he is by or under this constitution required to exercise his functions or any of them in his discretion. This is where the fundamental problem is. Ideally, the governor will have to listen to the council of ministers. Whatever the council of ministers say, he has to comply by it. He has to sign the bills as well, give consent to that particular bill proposed by the council of ministers. But in an unfortunate incident, in number of states in India, in West Bengal, in Maharashtra, in Rajasthan, in Kerala, what we have is the governor not paying heed to the aid and advice. In fact, the Supreme Court has also said, except in exceptional situations, where the situations are also been illustratively listed in number of Supreme Court cases, only in those cases the governor would have the discretion. But since this particular vague wording in the constitution also gives the provision for the governor to use his discretion in number of scenarios leading to friction between the governor and the council of ministers, says this article. So going forward, what this article intends is that the governors have the duty to defend the constitution, which is a constitutional office. In case there is a council of ministers, the state legislature not complying by the constitution, yes, the governor has every role to play in it, but this should not mean that he interferes in the day-to-day affairs of the state legislature is the first recommendation. Then identifying areas of discretion, fixing time frame for them to act, and making it explicit that they are obliged to go by the cabinet advice needs to be taken up. What is happening right now? There is a lot of discretionary power that is given to the governor. So changes will have to be brought and this discretion has to be defined. Where, in what areas the governor has the discretion, that should be explicitly mentioned. As of now, there is an implicit assumption that he has so and so illustrations, so and so areas where he would be able to showcase discretion power, but in the near future, what discretion he has to be explicitly mentioned. When a bill is passed from the legislature to the governor, there has to be a time frame within which he also has to give his assent, and finally he also has to listen to the advice of the cabinet is another recommendation. And in the past, we also had the Punchi Commission, which had also recommended the chancellor power which are given to the governors should be completely removed so that they are not overburdened with their job role. So chancellor in universities which are currently being the governors, such power should also be removed is another recommendation given in this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the Russian invasion is making the global chip shortage situation worse. The article here is speaking about the semiconductor chip issue. We did speak about the COVID-19 issue, how we were not able to get the chips from China, and now because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we also have the chip shortage, says this article. How is that there is a chip shortage? That is because Ukraine supply rare gases which are used in the production of semiconductor fab lasers, and we also have Russia which exports rare metals like palladium to make the semiconductors. Since both these countries are engaged in war, this could be a problem for the semiconductor manufacturing countries. Palladium, when we speak about it, is used in almost all electronic devices and is key material in making chipsets and circuit boards. Palladium is used as an alternative to gold in making various devices as it is highly malleable and resistant to corrosion. It is considered to be softer than gold but is much harder and more durable than gold. Palladium gives more protection against an impact and a greater resistance to denting. Russia and South Africa are the two largest producers of palladium. Since palladium is exported to multiple countries from Russia, and since Russia is engaged in a war, what we will have is issues and concerns with respect to the chip making. Also remember, palladium is used in chipsets and circuit boards. It is used in multi-layer ceramic capacitors which are important for the smartphone screens, stereo systems and power circuit breakers. Since they are not able to export right now because they are engaged in war, there could be issues with respect to the chip making, says this article. Now let's look into the mains practice questions. Is war ever morally justified? Support your answer with the help of just war theories. Next question. The victim suffers only the injury, but the offender under the retributive justice suffers both the injury and the anxiety of death penalty examined. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review. Do give positive feedback to your friends' answers as well. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.